A single egg sat on the table in the town hall, large as a blacksmith's fist and speckled a deep, earthy brown. It was the only object in the room that seemed sure of itself. The air, thick with the smell of dust and desperation, vibrated with the low murmur of hungry men. Silas Croft, the grain merchant, pointed a finger that was still plump despite the hardship. "It is an unnatural thing," he declared, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Hoarded by an unnatural woman while good folk starve." Anne O'Malley stood beside the table, her hands clasped behind her back. She did not look at Croft, nor at the pinched faces of the town council. She looked at the egg, at the solid, undeniable fact of it. She had placed it there herself, a quiet testament against the storm of words. The weight of their judgment pressed on her, the familiar burden of a woman alone. It was not, however, the heaviest thing she had ever carried. 2 years earlier, she had arrived in Covenant Creek with nothing but a canvas bag holding a spare dress, a tarnished silver locket, and a hunger so deep it had carved the softness from her face. The dust of the plains had settled into the very weave of her clothes, a permanent state of gray. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath, braced against a wind that never stopped blowing. Its welcome was a row of turned shoulders and narrowed eyes. She was another mouth, another problem blown in from the east. She asked for work at the mercantile, at the saloon, at the boarding house. The answer was always the same, a slow shake of the head, a door closed with quiet finality. Only one place was so forsaken that it had need of anyone at all. The blacksmith's forge at the edge of town stood silent, its chimney cold, its great doors shut against the world. Its owner, Ewan McGregor, was a man hollowed out by grief, his wife taken by fever the winter before. He had not struck a spark since. The forge was his tomb, and he wanted only to be left alone inside it. But the town council, led by Mr. Croft, had insisted. The place was a blight, a fire hazard. It had to be cleaned out, made right. Ewan, his eyes dull as river stones, had merely shrugged. He would pay a pittance for the labor, he told Anne, barely enough for bread. The work was heavy, filthy. He did not care who did it. Anne looked at his haunted face, at the broad, calloused hands that now hung useless at his sides, and saw a sorrow that mirrored her own. "I'll do it," she said, her voice rough from disuse. He led her through the main room, a cavern of shadows and the ghosts of ringing steel. Tools lay scattered, coated in a fine red dust. The great bellows slumped like a dying lung. In the back, past the quenching trough, was a fenced yard overgrown with thistle and burdock. And in the yard were the birds. There were 5 of them, tall as a man's waist, with long, scaly legs and bodies like dusty sacks of grain. Their necks were thin and reptilian, their heads small and adorned with a horny casque that looked like a lump of cooled slag. They were ridiculous, prehistoric creatures, and they stared at her with an unnerving, obsidian stillness. "Ewan's folly," the blacksmith grunted, a flicker of old anger in his voice. "Wife's brother sent them. Said they were the future. All they do is eat and make a god-awful racket." He kicked at the fence post. "Part of the job is feeding them. Part of your pay, too, if you want. Take them." "I want them gone," the town agreed. Anne O'Malley, the half-starved Irish girl, had taken on the town's most useless man, his derelict forge, and his 5 monstrous chickens. She had, they all concurred, lost what was left of her mind. The first week was an education in grime. Anne swept out years of accumulated metal shavings, coal dust, and dirt. She scoured the soot from the stone of the hearth until her knuckles were raw. She organized the scattered tools, wiping each one down with an oily rag, feeling the heft and purpose of them, the hammers, the tongs, the fullers and flatters. She worked from before sunup until the light failed, fueled by stale bread and a stubborn refusal to break. Ewan watched her from the doorway of his small attached house, a silent, hulking shadow. He never offered to help, but sometimes he would leave a pail of fresh water by the door. It was his only acknowledgement that she existed. The townsfolk were less reserved. "Still playing in the dirt, girl?" Mr. Croft would call out as he rode past, his tone dripping with false bonhomie. The women, gathering at the mercantile, would whisper as she bought her small sack of flour. "That poor thing. Living in filth with those awful birds." They called her the bird-mad girl of Covenant Creek. Anne heard them. She bent her head, paid for her flour, and walked back to the forge, their pity and scorn a cloak she wore against the wind. She did not have the energy for anger. All of it was saved for the work. Her true work began when the forge was clean. It began with the birds. While the town saw them as a noisy joke and saw only 5 living creatures who depended on her, she started by watching. They did not eat grain. They pecked at the ground with a strange, discerning focus, swallowing small, shiny pebbles. They tore at the toughest weeds, the ones with roots that could crack stone. And she saw them, more than once, pecking at the piles of rust and metal shavings she had swept into a corner of the yard. They consumed the very refuse of the forge. She remembered stories from the old country, of strange beasts that thrived where nothing else could. She stopped buying the expensive cracked corn the mercantile sold for chickens. Instead, she hauled buckets of river gravel for them. She spent an hour each morning pulling up the ironweed and burdock they seemed to crave, and she shoveled the finest of the rust flakes into their trough. Ewan saw her do it and shook his head, retreating back into his house. The madness was progressing, it seemed. One afternoon, a woman with a face as finely wrinkled as a dried apple and a back as straight as a broom handle stopped by the forge. It was Mrs. Gerda Schmidt, who had come from the old country decades ago and kept to herself, tending a garden that bloomed with strange, pungent herbs no one else knew the names of. She watched Anne for a long time as the girl patiently offered a handful of shiny quartz pebbles to the largest of the birds. The creature dipped its head and took them from her palm with a surprisingly gentle clatter of its beak. "They call you foolish," Mrs. Gerda said, her voice accented but clear. Anne did not startle. She had felt the woman's presence. She shrugged, not taking her eyes off the bird. "Talk is cheap," Mrs. Gerda nodded slowly, a small, approving smile touching her lips. "Ja is cheap." She pointed a gnarled finger toward a pile of discarded iron, red and flaking with rust. "The fool sees the rust, child," she said, her voice dropping into a low, instructive tone. "Thinks the iron is gone. The wise one knows the iron is still there. It has only changed its coat." And finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a deep, knowing calm in the old woman's eyes. It was the first kindness she had been shown in this place, and it settled in her chest like a warm stone. Mrs. Gerda said nothing more. She simply nodded once and continued on her way, leaving the words to hang in the quiet air of the forge yard. The birds began to change. With the new diet, their dusty, brownish feathers took on a strange, metallic sheen. In the right light, they glinted like blued steel. They grew less skittish. Anne moved among them with a quiet calm, and they began to follow her. She gave them names forged from her new world. The big, dominant male was Anvil. The 2 females were Bellows and Hammer. The second, smaller male was Tongs. And the youngest, a scrawny thing that was always getting into trouble, she called Spark. A bond was forming, a silent understanding built on routine and care. A young boy, Finn, the nephew of the saloon keeper, started to appear at the edge of the yard. He was a slip of a thing with wide, curious eyes, mostly ignored by his busy family. He would watch Anne for hours. He never spoke, but one day he held out a handful of glittering mica he had found by the creek. Anne took it and offered it to Spark, who devoured it with enthusiasm. After that, Finn became her silent partner, a hunter of shiny rocks and strange, tough weeds. He would leave his findings in a bucket by the fence, and Anne would leave a piece of her bread for him on the top rail. Then came the day that changed the arithmetic of her survival. She was mucking out their nesting shelter, a crude lean-to against the back wall of the forge, when her hand brushed against something smooth, heavy, and warm. Buried deep in the straw was an egg. It was magnificent. It filled her 2 hands and was heavier than any stone of its size. The shell was not the fragile white of a chicken's egg, but a thick, hard casing of mottled brown and gray, like a piece of granite. She carried it inside, her heart thumping with a secret, fierce joy. It had worked. She had been right. She held it up to the light slanting through the dusty forge window, a perfect, promising thing. That night, she banked the fire in the small hearth Ewan had in his house, but never used, and cooked the egg. It took a long time for the heat to penetrate the thick shell. When she finally cracked it open with the back of a hammer, the yolk was the color of a deep sunset, the white firm and creamy. The taste was rich, dense, and deeply satisfying, with a faint, mineral tang. It was more than a meal. It was sustenance. It was proof. One egg fed her for 2 days. She was no longer hungry. She started checking the nest every morning. Bellows and Hammer were laying 1 egg every other day, like clockwork. Basket after basket, her future was being laid in the straw. She told no one. She banked this success like a coal, deep under the ash of the town's perception, letting it glow in private. Ane's world, once bounded by the simple math of hunger, began to expand. She discovered the shells were as valuable as the eggs. They were incredibly hard, almost stone-like. Remembering old country poultices, she tried grinding one with a heavy pestle. It took an hour of hard work, but the result was a fine, gray powder. She mixed it with clay and water to patch a crack in the forge's hearth, a fissure that had worried her. The next day, the patch was as hard as the stone around it, harder even. It did not crumble or flake. It was iron-strong mortar. She began systematically repairing the forge, sealing the chinks in the walls, reinforcing the foundation, 1 eggshell at a time. The building grew stronger, less drafty, a fortress built of secret knowledge. The feathers, too, revealed their worth. When the birds molted, she gathered the long, stiff tail feathers. They were light but incredibly rigid, with that strange metallic sheen. She gave a bundle to Jed, a quiet man who lived on the edge of town and survived by hunting. He used them to fletch his arrows. He came back a week later, his eyes wide. "They don't break," he said, his voice full of wonder. An arrow glanced off a rock, would have shattered a goose feather. This one, not even a nick, he offered to pay. Ain shook her head. "Just bring me a rabbit now and then," she said. He did. Her diet grew richer. She, Finn, and the birds were a small, self-contained economy. Finn gathered the minerals, Ain tended the flock, and the birds produced the eggs, shells, and feathers that provided food, shelter, and a growing web of quiet alliances. She was still the bird-mad girl to the rest of Covenant Creek, but inside the walls of the forge, she was solvent. She was surviving. More than that, she was building. The arithmetic was simple but powerful. 2 eggs a week for her, 1 rabbit from Jed, a small bag of flour, and salt was her only expense. The rest, she saved. The coins went into a loose brick in the hearth, a growing weight of security. The town saw her walking with her head held high, the gaunt desperation gone from her face. They mistook it for pride or foolishness. They could not imagine the quiet abundance she was cultivating in their midst. They saw a girl with 5 useless birds. They did not see a woman who had learned to turn rust into iron, stone into bread. She was content to be underestimated. It was its own kind of shield. Her world was the forge, the yard, the quiet company of Finn, and the dignified, ridiculous birds she had come to love. It was enough. She did not yet know that the world outside her walls was beginning to crack. The catalyst arrived on the noon stage, which pulled up lame with a split axle just outside of town. The passengers were forced to stay the night, much to their disgust. Covenant Creek was not a destination. One of them, a man named Monsieur Dubois, was the head chef for a grand hotel in the capital city, and his displeasure was a palpable force. He sniffed at the saloon's offerings of stringy beef and greasy gravy. He declared the bread to be an insult. He was a man accustomed to the best, and he found himself in a place that offered only the barest minimum. Ain heard of his complaints from Finn, who had heard them from his uncle. An idea, bold and terrifying, took root. She spent the afternoon polishing one of the largest eggs until the shell shone like agate. She boiled it perfectly, and, wrapping it in a clean cloth inside a small basket, sent Finn to the boarding house where the chef was staying. "Tell him a gift," she instructed the boy. From the forge, Finn, his eyes wide with the gravity of the mission, scampered off. Ain waited, her stomach twisting. It was the first time she had offered her secret up for judgment by the outside world. An hour later, Monsieur Dubois appeared at the forge himself. He was a small, neat man whose anger had been replaced by an electrifying curiosity. He held the empty, cracked shell in his hand like a holy relic. "Who are you?" he demanded, his accent thick. And what was this? Ain, intimidated but resolute, simply led him to the yard. The 5 birds, Anvil and his flock, stood preening in the afternoon sun, their feathers glinting. The chef stared. He walked to the fence, his critical gaze assessing them not as a joke, but as livestock. He saw their clear eyes, their strong legs, the healthy sheen of their plumage. He saw a well-tended, thriving flock. Magnifique, he breathed. He turned back to Ain, his eyes alight with the fire of a culinary artist who has discovered a new ingredient. The flavor, the texture, the yolk, it is like the sun itself. Madam, I will buy them. I will buy every one you can produce. He named a price per egg that made Ain's breath catch in her throat. It was more than Ewan had paid her for a month of backbreaking labor. She did her arithmetic in a flash. 2 eggs a day, 14 a week. She could be wealthy in a year. She looked at the chef's eager face, then at her flock. She thought of the coins in the hearth. I can spare 10 a week, she said, her voice steady. They will be on the Wednesday stage, he agreed without haggling, pressing a gold coin into her hand as a down payment. When he was gone, Ain leaned against the forge door, the heavy coin warm in her palm. The world had finally looked at her work and seen its value. It was a dangerous and exhilarating feeling. She did not know that Silas Croft, riding past, had seen the whole exchange, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, calculating interest. That summer, the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue. The rains that should have come in May never arrived. By June, the creek had dropped, exposing a muddy, cracked bed. The wheat in the fields surrounding Covenant Creek, the town's lifeblood, grew stunted and pale before turning a sickly yellow. The blight came next, a creeping black dust that consumed what little had grown. The harvest was a catastrophe. Silas Croft, who owned the grain elevator and held the mortgage on half the farms, began to tighten his grip. Credit at the mercantile, which he also owned, dried up. The price of flour doubled, then tripled. Cattle grew thin, their ribs stark beneath their hides. A quiet, gnawing fear settled over the town. Laughter became a rare commodity. Faces grew harder, more suspicious. But at the edge of town, the forge remained an island of quiet industry. Ain's birds thrived. The drought did not touch their diet of deep-rooted weeds and minerals. They continued to lay their large, rich eggs with dependable regularity. Smoke continued to curl from her chimney. She and Finn, who now spent most of his days with her, remained fed and healthy. This did not go unnoticed. The town's mockery, once a thing of casual sport, began to curdle. The whispers were no longer pitying, but envious. Look at her, they would mutter, watching her walk from the forge. Not a care in the world. While our children go hungry, they didn't know about the baskets of eggs that now left on the Wednesday stage, or the growing weight of coins in her hearth. They saw only her apparent immunity to their suffering, and they resented it. Silas Croft cultivated this resentment like a prize crop. He saw Ain not as a clever girl, but as an untapped asset. He owned the town's hunger, and now he wanted to own her solution to it. He paid her a visit one afternoon, his smile as wide and false as a painted fence. He brought a small, withered apple, a gesture of supposed generosity. "My dear Ain," he began, his eyes sweeping over the clean yard and the healthy flock. "A terrible time for us all. A terrible time." Ain waited, her stillness a wall he could not breach. "A young woman alone. It must be so difficult," he continued, oozing sympathy. "I've been thinking. Those birds of yours. They are a burden, I'm sure. I would be willing to take them off your hands. For the good of the town, of course. I'll see they are distributed fairly." He offered her a handful of coins, not even a tenth of what 1 week's shipment to the city brought her. Ain looked at the money, then at his soft, well-fed face. "They are not for sale, Mr. Croft." His smile tightened. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by something cold and hard. "Think carefully, girl. A great deal of misfortune can befall a person who is not a friend to this community." He left the withered apple on the fence post, where it rotted in the sun, a small, dark omen. The pressure mounted. Croft's whispers found fertile ground in the town's fear. Rumors began to circulate that the Irish girl was a hoarder with a cellar full of food, that her strange birds carried disease, a blight of their own. The town's hunger was a fever, and Croft was feeding its delirium. One night, a rock crashed against the forge door. Another time, she found the gate to the yard thrown open, but the birds, loyal to her, had not scattered. Finn started sleeping in the forge on a bed of hay, a small, fierce guardian with a pitchfork by his side. Ain felt the town she had slowly begun to see as a potential home turning against her. its collective face twisting into a mask of suspicion and greed. The townsfolk who had once mocked her now coveted what she had. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. She stopped going into town unless absolutely necessary. The forge became a true fortress, its strong walls, patched with her own ingenuity, holding the hostility at bay. She continued her work, day after day after day, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of caring for her flock. But she began to do a new kind of arithmetic in the dark. Not the math of profit, but the math of survival against the coming storm. She counted the faces in town, the number of hungry families. She counted her eggs. The two columns did not align, and a cold dread settled in her heart. The crisis was no longer about her own survival, but about the choice she would be forced to make. The storm broke on a Tuesday. The town council, at the urgent request of Silas Croft, called a public meeting. The summons was delivered to Ain by the sheriff, a man whose weary face showed he had no stomach for the business. The meeting was to be held that evening. Its stated purpose: to address the equitable distribution of resources in a time of crisis. Ain knew what it meant. Croft was making his move. He intended to use the law, twisted by fear and hunger, to take her flock. That evening, she walked into the town hall. She was not empty-handed. In a small basket, she carried the single, perfect egg she had shown them once before, a symbol of her labor. She placed it in the center of the main table and stood behind it, waiting. The room was full, the air suffocating. Croft began to speak, his voice resonating with false piety and civic concern. He spoke of the common good, of shared sacrifice. He painted Ain as a selfish outsider, an opportunist who profited from their misery. This woman, he thundered, pointing his plump finger, sits on a bounty while your children cry from empty bellies. I propose the town exercise its right to appropriate this resource, to take these creatures and use them to feed our own. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Hunger changes a town. It makes decent people consider indecent things. When he was finished, all eyes turned to her. The silence was an accusation. Ain took a breath, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. She did not look at Croft. She looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw Mrs. Bishop, whose son had the croup. She saw Jed the hunter, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She saw the blacksmith, Ewan, standing in the back, his face a mask of conflict. Mr. Croft is right about one thing, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. There is a resource, she gestured to the egg. You have all called them Ewan's folly.